There was no courtroom, no newspaper willing to print his defense, no official space where he could argue his case. So he wrote it himself. In February of 1879, after the raid on Jerilderie, Ned Kelly dictated a document that would become one of the most controversial statements in Australian history. It was not brief, it was not restrained, and it was never meant to disappear quietly. Over 50 pages long when written by hand, the Jerilderie Letter was dictated to Joe Byrne as Kelly spoke. It was not a confession, it was an indictment. Kelly did not begin with robbery, he began with childhood. He wrote about his father, John "Red" Kelly, transported from Ireland for stealing pigs, a crime he claimed was exaggerated and used to justify harsh punishment. He described growing up poor, Irish, and already suspected. From the beginning, the letter frames his life not as rebellion, but as inheritance. An inheritance of scrutiny, of poverty, of distrust. To understand why the letter resonated at all, you have to understand the colony Kelly was writing into. Northeast Victoria was heavily Irish. Many families were small selectors struggling on marginal land, working farms that barely sustained them. Police in the region were often seen not as neutral enforcers, but as representatives of British authority. This tension did not begin with Ned Kelly. It predated him. Irish Catholic settlers frequently complained of excessive surveillance and aggressive enforcement. Historians debate how systemic this bias truly was, but perception shapes reality, and Kelly's letter tapped directly into that perception. He positioned himself not as isolated outlaw, but as example. He accused police of harassing his family long before Stringybark Creek. He accused Constable Fitzpatrick of dishonesty in the events that led to his mother's imprisonment. He described officers as men who trample on the poor and the innocent. Some of these claims reflect documented tensions. Some are unverifiable. Some are clearly exaggerated. And that is part of what makes the letter powerful. It is not clean history. It is grievance shaped into narrative. Kelly wrote at one point, "I am a widow's son outlawed, and my orders must be obeyed." The tone is defiant, but it is also revealing. He did not describe himself as a criminal. He described himself as a man forced outside the law. That distinction mattered deeply to him, and he wanted it to matter to the public. He did not deny violence, but he reframed it. Regarding Stringybark Creek, he argued that he believed police intended to shoot him without warning. He presented the confrontation as self-defense. Whether that belief was justified remains debated. But in the letter, it is presented not as aggression, but as necessity. And that framing changes the moral terrain. Because once violence is framed as defense, it invites something dangerous. Not agreement, but sympathy. The letter itself is not polished. It wanders, it repeats, it becomes emotional. At times it contradicts itself. Kelly condemns police brutality, yet defends killing officers. He speaks of injustice, yet justifies armed resistance. These contradictions do not weaken the document, they humanize it. It reads less like a legal submission, and more like a manifesto born under pressure. But there is strategy beneath the emotion. Kelly understood audience. He was attempting to move the conflict out of the bush and into the public imagination. If he could not win in court, he could attempt to win in memory. And memory is not controlled by warrants. When the gang raided Jerilderie, Kelly intended for the letter to be published. He left it behind, expecting it to circulate. It did not. Authorities suppressed it. It was not printed in full during his lifetime. And that silence shaped the legend as much as the words themselves. Because silence creates speculation. Speculation creates myth. Over time, the Jerilderie Letter became evidence for both sides. Supporters would later argue it proved Kelly was articulate, politically aware, and reacting to systemic inequality. Critics argued it was self-serving justification, an attempt to rationalize violence and elevate himself into something larger than he was. Both interpretations can be found in the text. That is why it endures. The letter was eventually preserved. In the 20th century, historians began examining it closely. Some were surprised by its coherence, others by its intensity, but nearly all agreed on one point. Kelly was not simply venting, he was constructing memory, and that may have been his most enduring act. Because once the letter existed, the story no longer belonged solely to police reports. It belonged to competing narratives. The government had declared him an outlaw. Now he declared the government unjust. Two declarations, two claims to legitimacy, and a colony forced to weigh them. The letter did not end the hunt. It hardened it. Because once a man begins speaking in ideological terms, the state cannot allow that narrative to gain traction. He becomes more than a fugitive. He becomes an argument, and arguments are harder to silence than men. The order had declared him beyond protection. The letter declared him justified. Between those two declarations, legend was born. In the next episode, we move toward the final collision, not just between men, but between narratives. Because when belief hardens on both sides, resolution no longer looks like justice. It looks like inevitability.